In this lesson, we're going to talk about calculating marginal and joint relative frequencies from a two-way table and how to calculate conditional relative frequencies from a two-way table. So first, let's talk about what a two-way table is. So when we're looking at two categorical variables, instead of taking a frequency table or a relative frequency table, we end up constructing a two-way table where each variable is on one side of the table, hence why it's called a two-way table. So here we have some examples of people responding to a survey, if they're in the environmental club or not, and if they have any use for a snowmobile, whether they own, rent, or have never used one. So we have two variables here. We have whether they're in the environmental club, and then their snowmobile use. So a two-way table is a table of counts, so this is frequency, that summarizes data on the relationship between two categorical variables for some group of individuals. So we take this data, and on one side of the table, so in the rows, here we have snowmobile use, and then for the columns we have environmental club member. You could switch these and have the club member be rows and snowmobile be columns. It really does not matter. That's a choice. Then you notice that there are numbers in here. These numbers are the count of people who said no, they are not a member, and they've never used a snowmobile. So there's 445 of those. Or like 77, this is yes, they are a member of the club, and they rent a snowmobile. Or 279 say they are not a member, and they own a snowmobile. The idea behind a two-way table is you think there's some type of relationship between the two variables. So here, being an environmental club member, if they are environmental friendly, maybe they don't use a snowmobile because of gas emissions or other factors. That's the idea. So we can take it a step further, and instead of just saying if they're a club member and then the snowmobile use, we add in their totals. The total amount that are in the club, not in the club, and the total of whether they use a snowmobile, if they've never used one, if they're a renter, or if they're a snowmobile owner. So now we get down to the percentages that we can find. These are associated to those relative frequencies, but they have a slightly different name because now we're looking at a two-way table. So using the same data, we're going to look at a marginal relative frequency. It gives us the percent or proportion of individuals that have a specific value for one categorical variable. So for instance, maybe we're looking at the percent that are not in the club. Well, that'd be 1,221 out of the total of 1,526 people that were in this survey. Or we can look at those that are in the club. So those are looking at the column totals. You could also do it by row. If they've never used a snowmobile, they rent one, or they own one. So as you notice, I have each of the numbers that's being used for the percentages highlighted in the table so that you can see where it's coming from. So marginal relative frequencies, remember, these are all about one categorical variable. So now let's look at a joint relative frequency. So this gives the percent or proportion of individuals that have a specific value for one categorical variable and a specific value for another. So now we're going to be looking at both variables at the same time. So a joint relative frequency helps answer questions involving both of the variables in the two-way table. So here's a question. What percent of people in the sample are environmental club members and own snowmobiles? Well, there are 16 in the survey that answered yes, they're in the club and they own a snowmobile. So 16 out of the total 1,526 are environmental club members and own a snowmobile. What proportion of people in the sample are not environmental club members and never use snowmobiles? So not in the club and never use a snowmobile, 445 of the 1,526. Now, there's a difference between these two questions. The first question asks for percent, the second one asks for proportion. Remember that a percent is a number between 0 and 100, whereas a proportion is between 0 and 1. A proportion is a decimal value. if we take that proportion and multiply by 100, it converts it to the percent. All right, so marginal and joint relative frequencies do not tell us much about the relationship. So we're going to look at what is called a conditional relative frequency. Conditional meaning we know something has occurred, or maybe they have identified themselves in one variable, and then we want to know the proportion of something in the other variable. So a conditional relative frequency gives the percent or proportion of individuals that have a specific value for one categorical variable among individuals who share the same value of another. That's the condition. So what percent of environmental club members, so this is the condition, we know they are an environmental club member. So what percent of environmental club members in the sample are snowmobile owners? So they are in the club is that vertical circle there. It said yes, there's 305. So out of the 305, how many of them are snowmobile owners? Well, that would be the overlap of the two ovals. We have 16. So 16 of the 305, which is 0.052, so approximately 5.2% of environmental club owners in the sample are snowmobile owners. You could go through and find out those that never used one, rent one, and own one, all for those that are snowmobile, are club members. So this is the distribution of snowmobile use among the environmental club members. This is a conditional distribution. You could do the same thing to find the ones that are the distribution that are not in the club as well. Notice that if you were to add the percents that are not, that would reach 100%. That would make sense because you would, if you think of the 445, the 497, and the 279, if you add those together, that gives you the total of 1,221. And the same for if they're club members. So a couple of things to remember. When you're comparing groups of different sizes, you need to be sure to use relative frequencies, percents or proportions. Because if we just say this group had more people use a snowmobile than the other, well, if their total amount in the group is not the same, then we can't really compare the count. We want to compare the percent. Then make sure to avoid statements like more club members never use snowmobiles, when what you really mean is a greater percentage. Again, all going back to the frequencies.